In 1921, Moscow was gripped by terror when gray sacks started turning up amid the rubble of demolished houses and abandoned construction sites. Inside these sacks lay the bodies of naked men, all killed in the same brutal way. Each victim had been dealt a powerful blow to the head. Panic swept the capital of Soviet Russia. In this young socialist state of workers and peasants, the first recorded serial killer in its history had appeared. They called him the Shabalovka Butcher, the Moscow Beast, the Packer, the Coachman from Hell. Nicknames for a man who murdered at least 29 people and became the first serial murderer in the Soviet Union. When the authorities finally caught him, the citizens of Moscow were ready to lynch him themselves. Even the trial, held in the halls of the Polytechnic Museum, was covered by none other than Mikhail Bulgakov. How did it all begin? In 1877, in the Vitebsk Governorate, a peasant family named Petrov welcomed a baby boy, Vazia. His father, Terenty Petrov, worked on the railroad. He was no shining star, but he dearly loved to drink. Then again, everyone in that large family shared the same weakness for alcohol. The destinies of many of Terenty's 12 children remain unknown. One of Vazia's brothers ended up in hard labor camps for murdering his own boss, a crime committed in a drunken rage. Vasily Vazia started working at a young age. By age 13, he was a shepherd, and he'd started drinking as early as 10, everything from homemade moonshine to denatured spirits. Remarkably, he was almost never sick. Nature had blessed him with extraordinary health. At 16, Petrov went to work for a local landowner who turned out to be stingy. So Vasily found himself a new employer. That one paid well but forced him to work hard. Eventually, the teenager decided to join his father's railroad repair crew. He spent his earnings on booze and snacks, but his money was never enough. So he stole from neighbors. His binge drinking finally stopped when he was drafted into the army at 20. After 4 years of service, Vasily returned to Vitebsk, ready to start a family. He soon married a local girl, but he took the model of marriage he had witnessed at home, constant drinking, arguments, and fights, and transplanted it to his own household. His wife was intensely jealous, and they quarreled often. Still, life with his wife was far from dull. The two traveled extensively across the Russian Empire, and the alcohol never let boredom set in. But trips require money, and the family's breadwinner had to find a job. Vasily ended up working at a military warehouse, yet his wages weren't enough, so he hatched a scheme. He illegally sold a batch of dried apples along with other provisions and was put on trial. After serving about a year in prison, Petrov decided to turn over a new leaf. Leaving his jealous wife behind, he moved to Riga, a city he had heard wonderful things about from fellow inmates. On a visit home to Vitebsk, Vasily learned that his penniless wife had been unfaithful, then poisoned herself and died. He mourned briefly, then returned to Riga and married again, this time to a Polish widow with 2 children. She was compliant and a teetotaler, but Petrov, used to the turbulence of his first marriage, often whipped both wife and stepchildren. She tolerated these beatings because her husband was, at least, providing for the family. Over time, she became so attached to him that she eventually became his partner in violent crime. In 1915, the Petrov family fled to the Volga region, running from the German troops advancing on Riga. When the revolution began, Vasily sided with the Reds. His time in prison helped him pass himself off as an oppressed proletarian under the old regime, and in those chaotic times, no one bothered to dig deeper into his past. Vasily learned to read and write and threw himself into the fight against counter-revolutionaries. After moving to Moscow, he rose to the rank of platoon commander. Petrov personally took part in executions, starting with the shooting of a white officer. That moment proved to be a revelation for him. He suddenly realized he enjoyed killing. At some point, Petrov fell into the hands of the white forces under General Anton Denikin, but managed to avoid execution through cunning and cleverness. What exactly happened to him during captivity remains a mystery. A year later, he returned to Moscow as though nothing had happened. By then he had abandoned his old surname Petrov and officially become Komarov. He also came back surprisingly well off, with enough money to buy a good house on Shabalovka Street. No one knew for certain where his fortune came from. One rumor claimed that he'd agreed to spy for the whites and had been well paid. A more likely theory was that, during the revolution's turmoil, Vasily had amassed his wealth through theft and robbery. For several years, the Komarov family lived comfortably, but eventually, the money ran out. In early 1921, when the country announced the new economic policy, NEP, Vasily purchased a horse and began working as a coachman. He initially worked for the Central Evacuation Commission, hauling goods and people while pilfering items to sell on the side. Before long, he left the commission and became a private cab driver. His behavior, however, soon drew attention. He rarely picked up passengers and spent most of his time at the horse market. Later, in court, Vasily would claim he had decided to eradicate the influx of speculators and criminals in the most radical way possible. His first victim, in February 1921, was an ordinary peasant who had come to Moscow to buy a horse. The dealers at the market pointed him to Komarov, who was supposedly looking to sell. They agreed on a deal and went to Komarov's home on Shabalovka Street to finalize payment. Not long before, Vasily had conveniently sent his wife and children out for a walk. Naturally, they decided to seal the agreement with a drink. The peasant got drunk quickly, opened up about his plans, and told Vasily that once he got the horse home, he would trade it for grain, bring that grain back to Moscow, and profit nicely. Later, Komarov would testify that it was at this moment he felt a sudden wave of hatred for the man. Excusing himself under the pretext of fetching more liquor, Komarov slipped into a closet, grabbed a hammer, and brought it crashing down on his guest's head. Mikhail Bulgakov, who covered Komarov's trial as a reporter, offered his own perspective on these killings. He slaughtered them like livestock, without pity, yet without personal malice. He gained, but not massively. The victim usually had about as much money on him as the price of a horse. It wasn't as though Komarov had sacks of riches hidden away, but he managed to eat and drink on it and support his family. He essentially had his own slaughterhouse at home. After murdering the peasant, Komarov stripped his victim, tied the arms and legs together, stuffed the body into a sack, and dragged it to a deserted lot where a half-collapsed house stood. Over the following months, he would leave more bodies there. Soon after this first killing, Komarov began to hunt regularly, finding most of his victims in the same horse market. The routine was predictable. He would befriend someone interested in buying a horse, propose they go to his place to seal the deal with a drink, then dispatch them with a hammer, strangle them if the blow wasn't fatal, and collect the blood in a galvanized tub so the floor wouldn't get stained. One day, Komarov's wife returned home at the wrong time and witnessed a murder. Rather than go to the authorities, she simply cleaned the blood off the floor. Over time, she became so accustomed to her husband's bloody profession that she began to help distract his guests at the table. When the deed was done, she would grab a bucket and rag and scrub the floor so meticulously that detectives later found no trace of blood. After each killing, the Komaravs would pray together for the souls of the departed. Sometimes Vasily even invited priests from the nearby church for a brief service, and then treated them to wine. In a single year, Komarev claimed 17 lives and eventually realized he was running out of discreet places nearby to hide the bodies. That's when he devised a new method. After each killing, he'd load the corpse into a sack, wait for nightfall, then drive his wagon to the banks of the Moscow River and dump the body. On one of these night trips, a police officer stopped him and asked what was in the sack. Unfazed, Komarev invited the officer to check it himself, but the policeman declined and let him go. After that, the killer began bringing his wife along on the nocturnal runs, figuring a family couple would attract less suspicion. Yet disposing of bodies in the river proved problematic. They would float to the surface, frightening fishermen. Meanwhile, more bodies stashed around the city were gradually being discovered by passers-by. In one instance, the remains of a brother and sister, both Smolensk market traders, were found in a wasteland near Connie Horse Lane. The investigation later revealed that Komarev hadn't even planned to kill the young woman at first. Only her brother had gone to his home, but the brother had no money with him. His sister was holding the purse strings. Komarev went back for her, then murdered them both. He stuffed both bodies in a single sack, but did a poor job burying them, so their legs remained exposed above the ground. Not long after these grim discoveries, more bodies turned up near an unfinished bathhouse. In total, police found the remains of 22 victims, and the city was in a state of panic. Rumors spread like wildfire. Vladimir Lenin himself reportedly gave the order to catch the maniac, triggering a full-scale manhunt. The best detectives and criminal experts in Moscow realized that a single perpetrator was behind all these murders, and they figured out he was likely a coachman because of the distinctive way the sacks, made of rough cloth used for hauling feed, were tied. The challenge was that Moscow officially had around 2,000 cab drivers, plus all sorts of drivers employed by various city agencies. Checking every single one was nearly impossible. Fortunately, the killer seemed to operate in Zamysk-Voriki, narrowing the search. Even so, it might have taken the authorities much longer to find him if Komarev himself hadn't made a fatal mistake. This time, he hit a victim so hard that he badly crushed the skull. Trying to stop the blood from spurting, Komarev covered the dead man's head with a baby's gauze diaper. He had recently become a father, and stuffed the body into a sack, diaper and all. Detectives soon linked the murder to a local cab driver with an infant child. In the spring of 1923, a police squad arrived at Komarev's home. They pretended they were hunting for illegal distillers and asked to inspect the premises. Komarev, suspecting nothing, let them in, even though a body lay hidden right there in the house. He began to worry only when the officers started examining the floor closely. Realizing the jig was up, he leapt out a window and escaped. He made it to the village of Nikolskoye outside Moscow, where he hid out at the home of an acquaintance who sold milk. That's where the police eventually found him, engaged in a peculiar pastime. He was writing memoirs of his murders, full of exaggerations that even implicated his neighbors. During the crime reenactments, officers barely managed to contain the crowds who wanted to lynch Komarev on the spot. Some demanded he be boiled alive. Wild rumors circulated that the Shabalovka butcher had fed his victims' entrails to pigs. Komarev denied this, saying, "If I'd been feeding them to pigs, I'd have raised more hogs." Komarev and his wife were examined by 3 of the Soviet Union's top psychiatrists. Their unanimous conclusion was that both were sane, although the murderer was deemed a degenerate brought on by chronic alcoholism. The trial of the Soviet Union's first serial killer took place in the building of the Polytechnic Museum. Komarov did not deny his guilt, recounting his crimes with brazen cynicism. He referred to his victims only as fools and suckers, and summed up the act of killing with a dismissive once and done. He seemed utterly uninterested in his own fate. When asked about the sentence he expected, he just sneered, it's all in the cards." In court, Komarov claimed 33 victims, though investigators could only confirm 29. Still, the verdict was obvious. He was sentenced to death. Among the journalists covering the trial was a then unknown Mikhail Bulgakov. The experience impressed him so deeply that he wrote a short piece called The Komarov Affair. These grisly events also left an impact on the celebrated poet Sergei Yesenin, who was at the time working on his poem Anna Snezhina. One of its main characters, Pranoglobulin, shouts Komarov's favorite phrase, "Once and done." Komarov and his wife were executed by firing squad in July of 1923, and their children were sent to an orphanage. From then on, for many years, Muscovites used Komarov as a byword for killers, another grim legacy left by the Shabalovka butcher. Only during the Second World War did people begin to forget about him, though rumors claimed that Komarov's son sided with the Germans and even executed civilians. If there's any truth to that tale, it belongs to a different story entirely. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories, and see you next time.